After studying this module, you would be able to learn about the construction of human spirit, evaluate the paradox of self, understand the essence of Sufism, which is love, and identify the purification and transformation of self. The nafs is a singular term that has been translated as self, nature, and also as ego. Nafs could be seen as grouped into different kinds. These are nafs of growth, nafs of sensibility or animal spirit, nafs of pure intellect, and nafs of wholeness and divinity. Each one of the nafs has powers and qualities of its own. The powers of nafs of growth are energies of attraction, circulation, digestion, and repulsion. Its qualities are to increase and decrease. The nafs of sensibility or animal spirit has the power of seeing, hearing, tasting, smelling, touching. Its qualities are lust and anger. The power of the nafs of pure intellect are thought, remembrance, awareness, patience, and its qualities are wisdom and virtue. The nafs of wholeness, divinity, has the highest virtue. Survival in annihilation, patience in misfortune, honor in poverty, and richness in adversity. The qualities of the nafs are submission and satisfaction in God. This is the nafs that the Almighty God breathes into the human being from His Spirit and is the part that returns to Him. According to a famous saint, a person is a book so clear that each letter on the pages manifests or presents a true and pure meaning.
Has been translated as self, nature, and also as ego. Nafs could be seen as grouped into different kinds. These are nafs of growth, nafs of sensibility, nafs of pure intellect, and nafs of wholeness and divinity. Each one of the nafis has powers and qualities of its own. The powers of nafs of growth are energies of attraction, circulation, digestion, and repulsion. Its qualities are to increase and decrease. The nafs of sensibility has the power of seeing, hearing, tasting, smelling, touching. Its qualities are lust and anger. The powers of the nafs of pure intellect are thought, remembrance, awareness, patience, and its qualities are wisdom and virtue. The nafs of wholeness, divinity, has the highest virtues: survival in annihilation, patience in misfortune, honor in poverty, and richness in adversity. The qualities of the nafs are submission and satisfaction in God. Construction of a human being and his spirit. The discussion on human spirit moves beyond the realm of dusk into the realm of celestial, from body to spirit. It is said that our spirit represents our identity. This is what a person should know if he is to appreciate his personal identity. The realm of spirit discusses the whole area from corporeal appearances, physical manifestations, and qualities and stages, which exist in the transition between the world of physical manifestations and the ultimate realm of inner meaning. It is important to remember that no matter how the categorization of the construction of a human being is done, a human being is not merely a structure of heavy physical and fine spirit. There are many levels and stages between the absolute matter and that of the absolute soul, many gradations between the dense material world and the fineness of the spiritual world exist in the human being. Many cultures and spiritual beliefs have ascribed to the levels and stages of the human soul, including the existence of souls after physical death until one arrives at the level of the Holy Spirit. The paradox of self. Unlike the teachings of Sufism, tell two seemingly contradictory things about the self. In the first instance, the self is the most dangerous trap in the path to God. It is the biggest obstacle. It is vile, it is beastly. It is only interested in the fulfillment of its animalistic and selfish desires. It is a veil to the truth and reality. It makes you believe things that are not true and makes you like things that are not good for you. It is difficult to recognize this because you have always lived this way, and people who live similarly surround us. At the same time, Sufism points to the other aspect of self, the high station of the self. Man is created in the image of God and is the height of creation. God created other creations for the sake of human beings and made man the master over other creations. He created everything for man and created man for himself. He blew his spirit into man and gave man the ability to rise above angels. He did all of this so that man could know him, worship him, and love him. The purpose of man's creation is to become close to God. In order to reach this destination of knowing his Creator, the traveler must travel a road of war with his ego until it is brought into submission. This is only possible by bringing the ego self to a place of servanthood. But modern man's ego or self has a big problem with the idea of servanthood. The irony is that man is in the grip of his demanding self and a slave to the material world, but he is not aware of it. Modern society promotes individuality, which in reality is slavery to materiality, yet ignores and shuns servanthood to God, which is the true purpose of creation. It is only through servanthood to God that man can actually be freed from servanthood to the material life. One cannot be a servant of God and a servant to oneself at the same time. In Sufism, dismantling and fighting the ego self is an essential part of the work. The degree of a man's success depends on the degree of the man's sincerity of effort. The most important work of the Salik is the difficult task of subduing the authority of the nafs, as it is our most dangerous enemy. One metaphor used to describe how one must deal with the self is imprisoning it, killing it, burning it, and scattering its ashes. The makeup of the ego self is in stark contrast to the serenity and peace, because peace and serenity are states that can only be experienced as a result of closeness to God. The self requires constant movement and turmoil. If events and problems in life are not enough to keep the system going, it will create more. Therefore, one is in a constant state of busyness of the mind, of inner chatter, of existing in the past or future, and in turmoil in order not to be present. All of these are constructs of the personality to fog and blur one's vision to what lies beneath, like waves on the surface of the ocean, preventing one from seeing the depth of the water. One exists in this fallacy of distraction until one day, by the grace of God, one wakes up just a little and realizes the untruth of life's predicament. When one makes the effort to quieten the mind and to negate the demands of the nafs, then, little by little, one purifies the state of the self. Only when the self is transmuted is one able to experience serenity and peace, and it is in that station that one can hear with the inner ear the voice of his Creator. Nafs, an evil or a friend. Sufism in practice is the constant attention to God, the awareness that He is and that He is here, near to you than your jugular vein. In the simplest terms, the heart is that which attends to God, while the nafas is that which blocks or interrupts this attention. Therefore, it behooves to know what the nafas is, to be able to identify it when it appears, to tell the difference between the nafas and the heart. The first thing is a set of moral and ritual standards, such as provided by the Sharia. It is not that obedience to these standards by itself will necessarily advance a person on the Sufi path, but without standards like this, the person will not be able to catch the nafas in action. The Sharia is God's command of what to be done and what not to be done. The Sharia is the line. The nafas is whatever crosses the line. Without the line, no one can pinpoint the nafas to recognize its own particular quality. It is also important that the rules that are followed come from the objective source outside the person. And ethical rules could be invented by oneself, but if the person himself is the authority that enforces them, then, for all their wisdom and practicality, they are at least partially an expression of the nafas, which means that they can't be reliably used to discover and isolate the nafas. The nafas is that which tempts a person through threats, antecedents, or distractions to violate the Sharia, but it also tempts to betray the guide. Certainly, it pressures to transgress moral rules. But once the practice of devotional acts begins, or constant attention to the presence of God, it also influences to let the attention wander away from God through every sort of obsession and distraction, every imaginable negative emotion or self indulgent mental pleasure, including false fantasies of so called heavenly realities. The work of isolating the nafas begins through watching for whatever tempts a person to disobey moral rules, but he developed and refined the understanding of it by watching for whatever distracts him from the constant remembrance of God. And dhikr not only provides a more sensitive gauge for the activities of the nafas than moral standards do, it also begins to establish a more objective standpoint from which a person can spy on the nafas antics without being observed. God is objective reality. The more real God is to a person, the more objective oneself becomes. To begin with, the nafas blocks the influx of the spirit into the heart. Later, it falsifies this influx, diverting it from its true goal. It either makes a person obsessed with moral purity or spiritual practice, or leads to indulge in emotional states and imaginary experiences one falsely believes to be angelic or divine. And when it finds that it can no longer block the spirit from entering the heart or divert it in various false and useless directions, it learns how to abduct the spirit, to claim it for its own. One cannot fight the nafas hand to hand, it is too strong, too cunning. One still might have to kick oneself from time to time, force oneself to do what so much of the inner self doesn't want to do and refuses to do. But this kind of struggle ultimately cannot be won because it is a struggle against oneself. Willpower must ultimately give way to submission. Forcing oneself to do something or avoid something must develop into Islam, surrender to God, and there can be no surrender without love. Instead of standing behind oneself and whipping oneself forward, one must learn to look ahead, to Him, to Al Hadi, the guide, and joyfully follow His lead. So, If a person cannot oppose the nafs directly and expect to win the battle, what could be done? What one can do is to watch it, discern it, and understand it. The time will come when the action of the nafs will appear in its true guise, and when it does, whenever it rears its head, one can say, "There, that's the nafs again. I would know it anywhere." Whether or not one can always overcome it, then the battle is already half won. In addition, perfect awareness of the nafs does in fact overcome it, because the nafs can only overpower a person when he identifies with it, and when he identifies with it, it disappears as a separate entity. One starts to think it is you. The veil of the nafs falls over the heart. But perfect awareness of the nafs cannot come until it is pacified, and the best way to pacify her is to make a bargain with her. Don't fight the nafs, just temporarily set her aside, and let the influx of the spirit enter the heart. And when the nafs protests, simply explain to her, what you really want is the spirit, but you can't have that just yet. If you try to grab for the spirit on your own, you will drive it away. And if the spirit enters the heart, and then you show up at the heart's table uninvited and ready for a hearty meal, you will eat up all the spirit in one gulp, go into an imbalanced ecstasy, and wake up the next day with a bad headache and no memory of what happened the night before. If you want your share of the spirit, you need to hold back until it fully enters the heart and becomes established there. Then, can you have your share of it? Certainly, you want to be satisfied and spiritualized and pacified. God wants that too. And once the spirit is fully established in the heart, the nafs will catch its overflow. From the veil that hides the spirit, it will be transformed into the mirror that reveals it, until it is ultimately indistinguishable from the heart itself. Every one of its impulses will become a virtue, every one of its attacks a protection, every one of its wiles a wisdom, every one of its twists and contortions a reflection of one of the names of God in the mirror of the human form. Now comes the end of the Sufi path, which is the Gnosis, or Marifa of God, which lies under the sign of Tanzi, the divine transcendence. There appears to be a paradox here, and one may get confused or fall into the trap of taking himself to be the higher self without wanting to acknowledge the lower animal self. It is important to recognize both aspects of self, the Satan and the angel, the shadow and the light, the ignorance and the consciousness. Within men are both potentialities. In the heart of man is the treasure of knowing his Creator. But he is sent to this world of distraction through attraction to temporal pleasure. The part of the self that is in absolute darkness becomes consumed with this temporal pleasure and material engagement. Becoming totally conscious of self and preoccupied with the material world, man does not pause to look inside himself to find the treasure within his heart. The treasure of knowing his Creator marks the highest aspect of the self. This is the self that is God conscious rather than self conscious. The purification of lower self, nafas, like the word tazkiya means to cleanse and purify, it also denotes increasing, improving, and a blessing. From this semantic perspective, tazkiya comprises the entire process of spiritual education. Purifying the nafas means is to cleanse it, primarily from unbelief, ignorance, evil thoughts, false convictions, and immorality. In other words, the purification of the self is an act of cleansing aimed at eliminating all kinds of theoretical and practical impurities. This process ends in filling the nafas with good religious and moral qualities such as sound belief, knowledge, gnosis, wisdom, and spirituality. The Sufi purification concentrates on lessening the lowly desires of the nafas, breaking its authority over the body and establishing the spirit's authority instead. This occurs only through practices of abstinence that strengthen the willpower against the lower self, and this involves a strict self discipline with regards to food, sleep, and speech. Sufism thus outlines the methods of disciplining the soul through three interconnected concepts: little of food, little of sleep, and little of speech. In establishing a spiritual authority over the nafs, these rules constitute the earliest steps. It should also be borne in mind that a wayfarer should not exaggerate the practice of these rules. Since the Almighty has entrusted one's body to the person, it has to be kept in mind the need to deal with it in moderation. In other words, during the process of purifying the lower self, a servant should keep himself away from excess in either direction. He should not overdo spiritual exercises in the name of taking the self under complete control, for Sufism commands moderation in all states and actions, and warns people against all kinds of exaggerative behavior. Furthermore, neither is it not possible to eliminate the self altogether, nor is this required. Instead, a believer is expected to purify his self in the sense of bridling and training it in accordance with divine instructions. The act of training and purifying the self is itself the most decisive factor in determining the nature of man's ultimate end, whether it will be one of destruction or happiness. To fulfill this process of purification, a servant should readily submit himself to divine will and resist against his lustful passions and indecent expectations. Every believer should be aware of his shortcomings, weaknesses, and ignorance. At the same time, he should truly comprehend the absolute glory and power of Allah, glory unto Him, and regulate his actions accordingly. If the believer is successful in this undertaking, then his evil commanding self becomes purified from immorality and thus turns into a praiseworthy self. Consequently, every believer should be mindful of the characteristics of his self and the responsibility he carries for its purification. He should take great care and use the appropriate methods in order not to fall victim to the nafas in the process. In other words, he who corrects himself will reach his destination safe and sound, while he who leaves himself to wallow in his excess and arrogance will face utter disappointment. This means that the nafas includes two functions working in the opposite poles. If one follows it unconditionally, he would end up in an eternal loss. But if one trains the self and takes it under control, he could reach a spiritual level even higher than that of angels. The self is the unique means that can lead one to both directions. Although all good deeds come with an outward aspect, they always have an essential inner dimension to be discerned. According to the Holy Quran, there are many verses in relation to purification of the soul. The term purification in these verses comprises three main aspects: the Almighty's purification, Prophet Muhammad's upon him blessings and peace purification, a person's own purification of his nafs. Purification by the Almighty. It has been seen and believed that purification belongs in reality to the Almighty, who by way of his limitless favor and mercy enables his servant to practice good deeds and guides him to the means of purification. The servant therefore should keep himself away from conceit and self-promotion, and instead hold the Almighty as the actual purifier. The servant should be mindful of the fact that his entire personal efforts towards purification will be useless in the hereafter unless the Almighty purifies him. This mindset provides the ultimate means to reach eternal salvation. Even though purification might be attributable to the servant with respect to personal will and effort, and to prophets and spiritual masters with respect to providing guidance and teaching. In the final analysis, purification is attributable only to the Almighty, who creates the means of purification for his servant and enables him to find these means. Purification by the Messenger of Allah. This fact indicates that those who possess unpurified nafs cannot attain to the true knowledge of things from their masters. Their knowledge will not benefit them, even if they might possess some bits of it. Since knowledge and wisdom are of invaluable importance, they do not dwell in ordinary places. A heart set to become a dwelling place for knowledge and wisdom is to be freed of all kinds of useless and dangerous grims. For this reason, prophets and saints first conveyed the divine signs, and then embark upon purifying the hearts of those to whom they have conveyed the signs. It is only at the end of this process that prophets teach the book and wisdom to persons who have thus become spiritually purified. The secrets embedded in this universe open themselves gradually only to those who possess a heart purified. Those who possess such hearts may even become springs of wisdom in their own right. A person's own purification of his self. The Sufi saints sees this purification as the most important one, as purification of one's nafs is the end of the road as it reaches to the truth or the divine itself. The command to purify is significant. The servant is expected to first cleanse his heart, body, and possessions from all negativity and immorality, which results in the unveiling the curtains of ignorance that stand between the servant and the Almighty, after which, with a body nurtured by lawful food and a heart mindful of the Almighty, the servant enters into the realm of mature servanthood and spiritual enjoyment. The believer is first expected to empty his heart and whole existence of all kinds of negative moral characteristics which resemble minor deities. Then comes the confirmation, which is when the heart becomes ready to receive and to be filled with the divine light. When a servant sets his heart only upon the Almighty, his reward becomes even greater. He becomes eligible in the hereafter to witness the manifestations of divine beauty and perfection, which are beyond the limits of linguistic description in this world. Whoever willingly directs his attention to the Lord alone and takes his Lord to be his sole concern becomes freed of all kinds of petty, temporal concerns. As for acquiring the knowledge of the divine, it begins with purifying the self, which then leads to a real understanding of its nature. In this day and age, where human beings live under the yokes of materialism and self-centeredness that darken their soul, there are innumerable obstacles that hinder one from an all-important task of directing his focus on the reality of the human soul and other spiritual matters. There is therefore a greater need today for spiritual masters to correct our misplaced direction. In Sufi terminology, this conduct is referred to as an inward investigation. This cross examination of the self, where all actions are re evaluated should take place at least once a day. When one becomes accustomed to it, he becomes less insistent on his habitual wrongdoings. A believer with a sound heart embodies three characteristics. He does not hurt anybody. This comes from a fear of the Almighty. The heart is protected from the evils of the ego, which brings exemplary character traits to the surface. He is never hurt or offended by anybody. This comes from a profound feeling of love. He never pays attention to the praises or censures of ordinary people. He always prioritizes the pleasure of the Lord at all costs. On being compelled to make a choice between the worldly and the hereafter, they never hesitate in choosing the latter. Transforming the self. The goal of all mysticism is to cleanse the heart, to educate or transform the self, and to find the God. The lowest level of the self is dominated by pride, egotism, and totally self centered greed and lust. This level is the part within each person that leads away from truth. The highest level is the pure self, and at this level there is no duality, no separation from God. The self is actually a living process rather than a static structure in the psyche. The self is not a thing. The Arabic term is related to words for breath, soul, essence, self, and nature. It refers to a process that comes about from the interaction of body and soul. Love, the beginning and the end in itself. The foundation of Sufism is love. The Sufis even say of their teachings as of the hymn to the divine love and call it tasavvuri, love vision. Love is considered in Sufism as the power which strengthens one's feeling of being contained in God. This process results in understanding that in the world there is nothing but God, who is the lover and the beloved at the same time. One of the tenets of Sufism is Ishq Allah Mabud Allah. According to the great Sufi poet Rumi, the love leading men to God develops through the development of the emotional, cordial love for all the beautiful and harmonious in the world, through active sacrificial love service to people, and then through extending this love to all manifestations of the world without discriminating between them. The Sufis say, if you make a distinction between things originating from God, you are not man of spiritual path. If you think that a diamond can enable you and a stone lowers you, then God is not with you. Such developed love for all elements of the creation is redirected then to the Creator, and man begins to see that, according to Rumi, the beloved is present in everything.
A summary of this module is as follows. Nafs is the ego, spirit, soul, self, or human essence. It could take on different forms like nafs of growth, nafs of sensibility, pure intellect, and wholeness. Each of this has its own powers and qualities of its own. Spirit is used in correspondence to self in Islam and Sufism. The realm of spirit consists both the physical manifestation and the stages which exist in the transition of this manifestation into the real and inner meaning. Self, when seen as the lower level ego, is related to an evil, but when this self moves, transforms into higher level being, at that point of time it attains goodness facets. The purification and transformation of soul is a long process leading to different struggles and difficulties. Purification in Islam has taken different aspects in purview. Like purification from Almighty or Prophet Muhammad, or a person's own purification of his nafs, in all the cases, the being leaves the darkness of self centeredness and moves towards the real reality, which are love, peace, and harmony.